Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is Chemistry, Chapter 8, Section 2, Part 2. So in Part 1, we learned about ionic compounds. So now in Part 2, we're going to learn about molecular compounds, or those compounds that are formed through covalent bonds. So please write this down. Molecular compounds have covalent bonds. Okay, so ionic compounds have some pretty standard properties, whereas molecular compounds are kind of all over the board. They vary. Ionic compounds are always solids, where molecular compounds, they could be solids, they could be liquids, they could be gases. And if it is a solid, it is a hard, brittle solid, or a soft, flexible solid. So some molecular compounds are hard and brittle, and some are soft and flexible. Another thing that happens is that they do not conduct electricity when dissolved in water. So if you have salt dissolved in water, it will conduct electricity, whereas sugar is a covalent bond, so if you dissolve that in water, it will not conduct electricity. So sugar water does not conduct electricity. So just like the ionic compounds, the properties of molecular compounds depend on the structure of the molecule, and now also the intermolecular bonds are very important between those molecules. So we're going to talk about covalent compounds, molecular compounds, by size. So let's start out with small molecules. Well, what do we mean by small? Small means you have a dozen atoms or less. And these will be in the liquid state or the gas state. The most important small covalent molecule, water. And most gases are small molecules. So let's look at some examples. So please write these down. We have carbon dioxide, CO2, oxygen, O2, nitrogen gas, which makes up most of our atmosphere, N2. Another fun one is ethene. We've talked about that before, C2H2. It causes fruit to ripen. And then looking at some of the liquids, ethanol, C2H6O, is a liquid and it is produced when sugars ferment, and this is alcohol. So the alcohol in wine or beer or any hard alcohol would be ethanol. Okay, looking at our medium-sized molecules, so then these would be less than 100 atoms. Now these are not going to be gases, so they're going to be liquids or soft solids. So they could be a lipid, like fats and steroids. And what is a lipid? Well, from human biology, we know that lipids are fats, and lipids are chains of carbon and hydrogen. And then they can include a small number of another atom like oxygen or nitrogen. So we're going to look at a picture of linoleic acid, which is a lipid found in vegetable oil. It's on page 239 in your book. And then let's talk about another type of lipid, steroids. So steroids aren't just like something illegal that you take. There's a lot of steroids that are naturally found in your body, and they are very important. So lipids that are carbon rings and are biologically important are steroids. So let's look at some examples. Cholesterol is a steroid. And what do we use cholesterol for? Well, if you have too much, that's bad for you. But some of it is needed for your cell membrane, kind of to stabilize that cell membrane. And then cholesterol is the basis for your body to make estrogen and the basis for your body to make testosterone. And a lot of medicines are kind of steroid or cholesterol based. Okay, so we're going to look at a picture of estrogen and testosterone during class. So other types of lipids are hydrocarbons. So hydrocarbons are molecules of hydrogen and carbon. And you can make long chains of carbon and then have hydrogens connected to those carbons. So the carbons will connect with other carbons and then also with hydrogen. But hydrogen can only make one bond. So if you have a medium-sized hydrocarbon, you're going to be a soft solid, like petroleum jelly or wax are medium-sized hydrocarbons. Okay, so for our mediums, we have liquids and soft solids. So some like liquid fats, some liquid lipids. We talked about steroids, and we talked about hydrocarbons. And then, before we move into large, we should probably talk about polymers before we move into large-sized compounds. So polymers are what? They are long chains that they are formed by a small unit that is repeated. So you have a long chain of repeating subunits, and those subunits are connected by covalent bonds. We call that subunit a monomer. And if you put many together, you get a polymer. There's mono one, poly many. So polymers could be medium or they could be large. So a fun example of polymers are plastics. So all plastics are polymers, long chains of repeating subunits. So if you look at the bottom of something, a bottom of plastic, it should have a number, 1 through 7. So for example, if it has a number 3, that means that plastic is PVC, or polyvinyl chloride. So let's break down that word a little bit. Poly means many, and then vinyl chloride is that monomer, which means there are many vinyl chlorides connected together to make PVC. So in your book, there's a picture of vinyl chloride and polyvinyl chloride on page 240. And we're going to look at our plastics. So we'll look at this website during class. Okay, so we know plastics are an important polymer that are synthesized by humans, and they're important in our modern world. And there are a number of polymers that are naturally made. So let's look at some of those. Starch is a polymer, and so you have a glucose molecule. You have a whole chain of glucose molecules, and I want you to come up with an example. Starch is a polymer of the sugar glucose, and starch is found in, fill in the blank. And then cellulose is also a polymer of the sugar glucose, but it is the structure of starch is a little bit different than the structure of cellulose. And cellulose is found in, and I want you to fill in the blank, please. So we know that glucose is the monomer, and then our polymers could be starch or cellulose. So we're going to, in your book on page 240, they have glucose, starch, and cellulose. They have pictures of those. Well, a polymer doesn't have to be just the same monomer, like vinyl chloride to make PVC or glucose to make starch. Polymers could be made of different monomers. A good example of this is proteins. So we know proteins are polymers made up of amino acids. So they are long chains of amino acids, and the amino acid is the monomer of proteins. And there are 20 different amino acids. So each protein has its own unique chain of different amino acids, and that determines what protein it is. And then we're going to look on page 241 at amino acids, the monomer, and proteins, the polymer. Another type of biologically important polymer is DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and that is made of nucleotides. It's a big long polymer of nucleotides, and those nucleotides are the monomers. So a nucleotide, each nucleotide has a sugar, a phosphate, and then one of the 4 nitrogenous bases, adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine. So you have 4 different monomers that make up a DNA polymer. Okay, so let's talk about large molecules. So a large size molecule is something with 100 atoms or more. So most polymers and most biological molecules are large molecules. There are some network covalent molecules, and this is usually the same atom that is covalently bonded together, and it could be 100, it could be 1 billion. So we could have a diamond is a network covalent molecule where the carbons are all connected to each other, and you could have just 1 billion carbon atoms connected to each other. Carbon can form other network covalent molecules. Please write this down. Carbon can form many types of network covalent molecules. So we talked about diamonds. Graphite is the same thing, except it hasn't been pressurized. It just comes off in these sheets. And then we have a lot of carbon filaments. So you can make carbon nanotubes and make a lot of things. Anything that has like a carbon frame or carbon filament, that's going to be made with carbon network molecules. And we can look at the difference between them. So any kind of nanotechnology, like things that are getting smaller, is important because of carbon. And there are pictures on page 242 of the difference between diamonds, graphite, and carbon nanotubes. So for large, we talked about our network covalent molecules, and we also talked about polymers, like proteins being large molecules, and DNA, our nucleic acids, and RNA being important large-size molecules. Okay, I think we're going to pause there. In our next video, we are going to talk about writing names and writing formulas for molecular compounds. I will see you then. Bye.